Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Oh boy. When software updates itself, boy, does it throw me for a loop. Holy smokes. I'm struggling this morning. The application that we use to stream all of our video is, for whatever reason, some genius decided to update their UI, and I can't find any of the buttons. The whole flow of streaming things is totally different. It throws me for a total loop.
Happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
It's not happy. It is not happy.
It's a harsh Happy Tuesday.
It is rough, man. Our main topic for today will be talking about domains. The article, we'll throw a little article here inside the chat window as well for Microsoft Fabric domains. Just thinking through, how do you leverage domains? How to unpack them? What does it mean for your organization? And when would be a good time to use them? So I'll throw that here as well for those who want to just kind of follow along and read up on the article. It's actually a pretty short read. It's not a very long article from Microsoft, but it does give a good feature overview of what a domain is. All right. Jumping back in here, quick updates or announcements. Any news items here? I have one, but I'll see if anyone else has anything first.
I mean, if you're a government worker or work in the government cloud of Power BI, yeah, there's a huge announcement. The admin monitoring workspace is now available in those cloud tenants. You know what this reminds me of is
how they can stop counting beans.
I'm kind of like, I obviously do not work in the government cloud. I've had this for a long time. It reminds me of when Power BI first came out and they still supported on Power BI report server, right?
Yes.
And they tried for a while, I think, to keep pushing all the cloud features into Power BI report server because people were still wanting the on-prem version.
Yes.
And it was just like, yay, because we're like months past the new feature and everybody's using it, and then all of a sudden it's like, cool. But anyway, that's really mean of me because there are probably a bunch of people that work in the government cloud, and I just
they're thrilled to see it.
Anyway, they're thrilled to see it. It's good to see it.
I can tell where you sit on the government side of things. All right.
Wow, unfair. Unfair. No, it's just one of those things where it's like, oh, it's not my problem because I don't have to work in that arena.
Well, my understanding is the government cloud, I mean, they get their Power BI tenant is a entirely separate tenant. It is a totally different interface. I mean, it's its own data center. They've got their own lockdown data center that is just there. There's a government tenant that is just for their stuff, which makes total sense because they can't be in the public cloud.
I would imagine that the level of scrutiny or things that have to go through things are counted a long way.
And I used
anything was implemented.
Yes. I will say this too. I've also used the argument. Sometimes companies will come to us and say, "Hey, we can't use your Power BI thing. It's in the cloud. We don't do that." I'm like, well, okay, I understand. I hear your point. I could totally see that being a policy in your company. And then I kind of bring up a couple things. Do you realize you already have SharePoint Online? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, that's already in the cloud. You trust that already. And
then my 365.
Exactly. And then I go, okay, so that one you're already in the cloud on, but you trust that one, and that's okay. And then we would then, kind of explore. Well, we wouldn't never put financial data on there. That's just not.
Really? Well, you heard of Excel online?
Exactly. There's a couple arguments to make you to bring it towards a place where it's probably fine. Probably fine.
We can have people logging in and seeing data on the internet and in the internet,
the browser.
Like, really, you'd rather them do what they're doing right now, which is send it via untraceable email.
Yes, exactly.
Download it and use personal email accounts.
Sure.
Just kidding. That never happens.
That never occurs. It's never published to web.
Punchy jabbing this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way the tone of this is going. Let's keep it up.
Okay. All right. Well, if we're doing punchy jabby, I don't know what inspired me, but every so often I'll go to the Microsoft blog, and then I'll go click over to. There's a page on there where you can go click into downloading Power BI Desktop. And just so happened yesterday, I found, oh, look at this. Power BI Desktop just created a new version. So I went down to the website. I went advanced options. I downloaded Power BI Desktop. I even tweeted it on Twitter and said, "Hey, look, a new version of Desktop is here." I downloaded the application. I ran it. I have borked my Power BI Desktop. I cannot open any files with it. I don't know if I turn on a preview feature or something that's just not happy. But when I downloaded it, I brought it on my computer. I have an error. It will not load. I don't know what's going on. So I'm kind of in the process of like deleting it, restarting it. I have another version of the Power BI Desktop, and it works from the Microsoft Store. So if you go to like the Microsoft and get Desktop 2 from there, that one still runs for me. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it's just my computer or if it's something bigger than that. There's actually an issue with the build of the application. I will also note, yesterday, the desktop application was released, and we still don't have a blog about it, which is sometimes indicative of someone caught a bug on the way through, and it's getting fixed.
Which is ironic because right before we started the stream here, I was like, that's crazy because I started diving in and had to do some report work and yesterday and got the, hey, you're opening a late older version. Some of the features might not be. Oh, I was like, fine, I'll just go grab the latest version. I do what you do. I download the version, so I have it.
Yep.
And I downloaded the version yesterday. But Mike and I were comparing versions, and I must have just gotten the July release before the August one was released. So I was like, I'm good, man. I was smooth sailing yesterday.
So I don't know what happened there. That was very weird for me, and I'll reinstall. So just bear with me. So what I would maybe caution you or for you listeners of the podcast, if you go out to Microsoft website and download their version of the installer, you may want to just hold off for like a day or two and just wait for the blog to come out before you download it. That might be a wise thing to do. Or if not, hang on to the old one. So I'm not sure if anyone else is having issues, but if you have any issues, let us know in the chat. I'd love to whine about it with you.
What I'll look forward to is Thursday's episode where we either confirm or clarify either this was a widespread issue or PEBCAC.
Or identi error
problem exists between keyboard and computer.
Yes, or ID10T error.
It's a unique problem that only you have for some reason.
Could have been. I made my little noise, and hopefully someone will figure it out.
Well, I hope so. I hope to see a blog released here pretty soon for the August update.
Yeah, let's see what's new. Exactly. Awesome. Anything else we should cover? Any other? Let's go quickly. Any beat from the streets? Anything that you've learned in recent consulting or work things?
I will like news bit, kind of a precursor because I just saw it this morning. But Kratos BI put out a blog or video. I gotta go check it out. He did a comparison between Fabric and Databricks. We're going to be talking about that, I guarantee. So I haven't read it yet, but go check that out for next episode.
Looking forward to that one. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and I was indicating the capabilities of Fabric have quickly turned my eye towards Fabric recently in the last couple months. And I think of it like a spectrum. I could only use Databricks or I could only use Fabric. And I think as I'm looking at what kind of projects I could start using more and more towards Fabric, I'm actually looking at some older projects that we've done. Anything around Synapse. If I used Synapse in concert with Power BI, I'm immediate going, I don't want Synapse anymore. I'm going to see those projects are an immediate, let's go get Fabric for those projects immediately. There's nothing in Synapse that Fabric can't do, I think, at this point. So I'm actually reviewing some older projects and modernizing them by bringing them into Fabric a bit more, saving a bit of money because it all lives in one ecosystem instead of having to pay the Synapse people and then the Databricks people and then the Power BI people. So trying to really delineate that between different environments. We're getting much better experiences there, I think.
Cost consolidation, or at least, make it hopefully simpler.
Well, it's this idea of like, I'm already paying for Fabric. Even if it runs, like, honestly, it's like this idea of like, if it runs slower, I'm already paying for it. So why would I pay more for a second or a third tool to do data engineering when I'm already paying a certain amount of spend? And okay, fine. We compromise a little bit. Maybe my data loads don't run as fast as Databricks, or maybe I don't have Delta Live tables. But if it goes from like 30 minutes to an hour and a half, who cares if I'm now not having to spend money on something? Like sometimes the loading things, a lot of what I do, and this is potentially, there's a lot of other businesses out there that do things. A lot of what I do is we load every night of yesterday and older. We're doing historical data loads. So if you're doing that, batch processing makes a ton of sense. Doing it in late in the evening, early in the morning kind of things works really well. And it doesn't really matter how long it takes. I mean, I'm saying that kind of flippantly though, because there are needs like, hey, data better be there by 6 a.m. Okay, I get it. That makes sense. So you do have requirements, but in that respect, there is some flexibility there. Indeed. With that, any other news or beat from the streets? All right.
I think we're golden. I'm just happy that you guys were on top of versions in Power BI desktop, because we'll wait the blog, and of course we'll talk about it on our next episode.
Okay, sounds good
for us.
All right, we'll go with that. Love it. All right, moving on. Let's go into our main topic today. So let's talk about domains. Seth, I want to kind of pick on you. You've read through the article. I've read the article. Tommy maybe has read the article. Tommy didn't tell me beforehand if he did or not. But that being said, Seth, give us a quick summary of what is a domain in the context. I think this is like context of Fabric. I mean, you probably use this in Power BI too.
Domains.
It's Fabric domains kind of. I mean, they've kind of changed our language. It's kind of the same. It's really hard to talk about, is it a Fabric thing or is it a Power BI thing? You can use domains in Power BI Pro, right? Or is it only a Fabric-based thing?
That's a great question, actually.
I think it works in both, but I think it works more with like, it feels like it's geared towards premium things. Like when you're using multiple premium SKUs, potentially.
Yeah,
there's some features
and I think we were even talking about it because you pointed this out in a previous conversation where I was like, it'd be great. It'd be a great way to organize workspaces. That's what they should build, like some sort of work. Oh wait,
that's domains. That's kind of where I'm going with this one. Part of this is I'm just trying to think through like, how do we leverage this concept of domains? And there's an interesting feature in domains that I haven't really thought about yet, but I'm trying to unpack a little bit. Around delegating administrative features to the domain, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. So I think the main thing that they point out in this article is, the organizations are shifting from traditional data IT centric organized things, right? And you get certain access, and now it's Power BI has pushed this boundary, and not only is it providing organization, I guess, for admins, so there's definitely still an IT-centric bent to this, but domains and subdomains allow us to kind of decentralize some of the data architecture, right? And that's what kind of the first opener part of this tech article kind of states, leans into the whole data mesh and decentralization of data architectures, et cetera. But ultimately, what that means for us is we have some additional security and permission, so roles we can assign to domains that start to kind of separate out and give more power to each individualized group as we kind of create this ecosystem for management of our data and infrastructure, right? So it's not just all controlled and centralized in the one place. Now we're starting to decentralize that, or the way I like to think about it is you still have your IT admins, right? They're just not managing everything in one silo. It's just when you interact with different business areas and groups, it's almost it's a much better way to do that because we have the structure of creating ecosystems for them, and you just manage in that ecosystem.
One thing that came up when you mentioned this one is Microsoft is pointing towards this data mesh methodology. Mm-hmm. And what I get a lot of confusion around, and what I try to speak to a little bit, is what's the difference between data mesh and data vault? I don't really understand the difference between those two items. I feel like I hear those terms kind of used interchangeably.
Really?
Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that. Have you heard of the data vault thing? And how is a data mesh different than a data vault? Is it kind of the same thing?
Okay, so from my understanding, we should Google some of this stuff.
I'm chat GPTing it right now.
Yeah, well, typically here's my off the cuff hot take, right? Like
Yeah.
from what I do know, right? Like data mesh is more, I think, geared towards about being distributed across an organization. Right?
Okay.
Like I have separation of different things, but at the same time access to everything I need.
Okay.
Right? Data vault, I think, is a very specific methodology of how you build models and construct the data model itself for generating insights.
Okay. So
right? It's much more Kimball versus star schema versus I'm going to go the data vault route, which is wildly different. And that's my understanding of things.
So if I had to articulate what you're saying, again, I'm trying to unpack this a little bit, right? Data vault is focusing more on, could be still centrally IT managed, but it's a very specific way of thinking about building a data structure versus data mesh is more of like, we have domains and there's going to be multiple domains that potentially will have data and information for them. That's kind of how I understand it.
Well, so I think it's even before that, right? I'm separating out my data domains, my data things into different areas, but the data is still accessible, right?
Yes.
So for instance, that's the precursor to data vault, which is a data modeling approach and methodology. Like I'm creating dimensions and facts and different things with that data, whereas data mesh is the precursor to that. You have data in these locations which you're doing like reshaping for reporting or business intelligence needs. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
At least that's the way I think.
I like that.
I could be wrong, but
that works for me. And that's actually kind of my interpretation. So to that end, this is why I think Microsoft brings up this whole concept of domains now, because domains, I think, fit this concept of meshes of data, right? I think the data mesh talks to like, hey, we have the sales team sets of data. We have HR teams of data. We have operations teams of data. And so while we're not trying to build silos, each team can kind of work on their data as needed in their area, their domain, essentially. And so this is where I think when I look at the feature of domains from Fabric domains, this makes a lot of sense. Because a domain, literally in the first part of their key concept here is we want to think about a domain in Fabric as being a logical way of grouping together your data in the organization. And when I think about that, I had to think about, okay, what is my mind as an architect goes immediately towards what does the architectural diagram look like, right? Who are the people that we're trying to serve with this stuff, right? There's a center of excellence. We have that team of leading people making governing choices around the tenant. Then we have sales, operations, whatever these teams are, right? And there's subject matter experts in each of those teams. And it makes sense that the sales team wouldn't just have one workspace for everything they need. If you're a bigger organization, you're going to probably have thousands of workspaces. Like how do you govern thousands of workspaces and find, you might have multiple premium SKUs. You might have, I've seen organizations have anywhere between 8 to 10 premium subscriptions that are all rolling around their tenant. So how do you collect or how do you aggregate, okay, there's 10 workspaces or 15 workspaces, who needs to own that? And I think there's a lot of this feels like very similar to what we've been doing inside just getting access to data, right? We have to have some level of trust between different departments. And what I mean by that is, Tommy, let's say you're in charge of the sales team. You're working on getting sales and marketing material together, right? That is your domain. You're an expert in that area. Somewhere, the center of excellence has to trust Tommy to say, look, Tommy, you're going to manage who's in or out of your area. Like you're hiring new people, you're letting people go. Like there's some turnover there. So you need to manage, okay, who is in your workspaces, and maybe as central, community of practice, we give some guidelines around, hey, our COE, here's how we want you to build things. You can do dev prod, you can do dev test prod, but really that could be the decision of that domain, that team. And Tommy's like, yeah, I'm super comfortable in Fabric. We're going to have full dev test prod. We're going to build what we want to build. We'll share, here's how we're going to share data back to the rest of the organization. And so your team can own everything in your domain, right? You're getting the data from Salesforce, from LinkedIn, from whatever you want. You're pulling all of your marketing data down, the website data. Boom, it all comes to your area. You can then shape it and use it for your space.
And this is a big part where the domains, and I was trying to look up the mesh side of things, and that really changes what we've thought of security in the past with Power BI. Up until now, and I just did a training last week, and we're talking about workspace management and collaboration. And it's really the two audiences that it's always been. It's been the consumers, it's really been collaborators or authors. The domain feature, and I really want to get into the subdomain feature. I think, Mike, you kind of mentioned that offline to me, but really the ability to associate with the workspaces, to have that higher level view, and that it's not necessarily just more organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually what the security side of it is. It makes total sense. And especially, I was going through this. If it was just Power BI, would domain still make sense? And probably not. This is a very Fabric feature. Even if you weren't if you were just doing Power BI models and reports, domains wouldn't be nearly as impactful as it would be with all the Fabric artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting.
Oh, go ahead, Seth.
No, I think what's interesting is while we talk about, this mesh architecture, or separating out the ownership of particular areas, it makes a ton of sense. But at the same time, it doesn't remove the responsibility from the centralized IT team. Right? And I think that's where even initially some of our conversations were going, which was, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Every department needs their own engineers and all these things. And where do these roles go? And where I'm landing now is they don't go anywhere. This is just, in all actuality, a better way to organize things for ourselves, especially when they're accessible, right? So you think about the worlds that we play in all the time. Sometimes it can be a chaotic mess, right? And you're still going through these steps to organize and structure data and architect it in a way on the back end. Well, to me, this is a simpler approach of I have physical barriers and the structure is in the ecosystem itself that helps me navigate and build solutions for particular areas, or put it in a centralized area. Because the fantastic approach with this is such that all it requires is me to share or gain access to data locations, right, where they may live, as opposed to having to re-push it or put it into a different system for accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's across the board, I really like the solution because you can separate out costs through the capacity assignment for all these workspaces. You can have as many workspaces as you want. And there's multiple levels or tiers of, hey, I'm the commercial team, but there's commercial operations, there's commercial, whatever, there's, go get, there's blah, blah, blah. And all those can be subdomains that don't necessarily need different permissions, but all roll up under, this structure that is managed, that you provide security around, that you understand costs, but you also build closest to the subject matter experts in these workspaces, right? So it's almost a way of, I guess, separating out what we only used to do on the back end into the fabric of the organization.
Yeah, I like that explanation. And what really picks my brain here a little bit around the domains piece is, if you read about halfway down the article, it starts talking about you can have a domain. It's a collection of workspaces. Makes sense. You have these have subdomains. You can have a subdomain that lives underneath a bigger domain. So you can start having groups and smaller groups inside there. Cool. Very interesting. But there's a section halfway down, or when you click on it, it starts talking about the ability to delegate settings to the domain level. So if you think about who is accessing this information, you can actually delegate or share those settings. Like, for example, let's talk about certification. I think certification is a good way to think about this, right? We have tenant level settings of certification. But what you may want is, again, going back to our example earlier, Tommy, you have a department of sales and you want to administer things in the sales department.
Mhm.
You have a collection of maybe like 5 to 10 workspaces and you're managing that team, right? You're owning it. You're helping your team build stuff. You're building your own data pipelines, whatever you're doing there. At some point, Tommy, you're going to say, I think we have data that's clean enough. It's good enough. We want to certify it. That way the salespeople or the people that can access that information, we want to certify our own internal content for that area. And so this is where I think this is a great relationship. The Center of Excellence can decide what is the policy on which teams are allowed or enabled to be able to certify their own data. What is their criteria that we're going to use as a standard across organizations? That way, when the sales team sees certification from Tommy, and the operations team's certified data from Seth, we know that that's gone through the same process. There's the same amount of rigor that's going through there. So I think it's up to the Center of Excellence to define those things, but that's a setting you can delegate down to that team. And in the admin portal for the settings of your admin settings, you can say this feature can be delegated to domains. And when you turn that feature on, that domain can override a tenant setting for the collection of workspaces that live in that domain. And the admin of the domain has the control to turn those things on and off. I just want to think on that. Like, I want you to kind of like really, really understand this one. This, I think, is a very powerful feature. Not sure everyone would want to use it, but I think as you get a bigger organization, this is a very useful feature here.
And I think there's a lot with that I'm thinking about, both on to your point, the Center of Excellence, and also data governance and the committee on who's owning the creation and the management of the domains and subdomains, right? Because this is no longer just a IT admin or a Power BI tenant level admin who's responsible for this.
I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think there's a difference there. So if you look at the different roles between the different roles, there is a Fabric admin, and the Fabric admin can create or edit domains. And then there's a domain admin that the domain admin basically adds or does not add people to the domain, or can manage which workspaces are there. There's also settings inside in the admin space. And then there's a domain contributor, right? So I don't think I'm worried about, I still think the creation of the domains is centered in a central team. That is your Center of Excellence. They are deciding what domains make the most sense for your organization. I don't think you're having admins inside the domain creating their own domains. They may create their own subdomains, but they're not creating net new domains. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think I'm not sure if I understood your comment, because it sounded like you were saying admins of a domain can make new domains.
No, what I was saying is who the ownership in terms of the management of that, right? The like who's actually creating it is one thing, but who decides what domains there should be and what subdomains there should be.
But that's the same. Okay, so
There's the
your
structure of
question
it, and
your
there's the
question
creation
is
of it.
confusing because we answered part of it already.
Okay.
Right. And I would agree, because it was a question I had, and who creates the domains, or who's in charge of the structure of them.
Yes.
And that should be COE or organization, like a conversation of how you as an organization are going to structure these to have them make the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the administrator. The admin doesn't care how you structure them. He or she's just in charge of managing the ecosystem that they're told to go build or monitor or control. And I think that's where you're mixing the two, right? Where the admin then has to work within this ecosystem, and it could be different. Like to Mike's point, you could, like, there's permissioning on domain levels. There's things that we can delegate to domain admins that could override. And I agree. I do love that, because there may be a department that you want to open up a whole bunch of settings.
Yep.
That, or organizationally wise, you wouldn't want, right? So like totally get that and love it. It just it adds just another subset level of control that is the ownership or onus is on the admin of whatever. So like it is interesting, I guess, to me that initially would subdomains be this free for all? Maybe, as long as all of the tagging and capacity and everything rolled up to the domain level, I wouldn't care as much as an admin or someone who is going to utilize that structure for other purposes, i.e. cost control and where things
Yep.
are going, and
Yes.
understand in the ecosystem where usage is happening.
Mhm.
Then I don't care if there's like, hey, yeah, the commercial team wants to break out 5 different sets of workspaces to align with their organizational structure. Like that makes tons of sense.
Yeah. And to be clear, there's not a lot of things that can be delegated or not. So if you go into the admin tab, it's kind of interesting because some things are just forced on. For example, some of the things that are automatically delegated, things like data activator, a lot of the preview features, right? So imagine this too, right? You have a domain, you have workspaces being created. You want to allow that team. Do you want them to be able to create data activator things or not? Do you want them to create certain preview features or not? That domain potentially could choose whether or not they want to use those features or not. But you may also have the idea that, hey, that's not something we're going to turn on. So when you go into the feature for data activator, you can go in there and you can enable it, but there's an option that says capacity admins can enable or disable. It's you the delegation setting, you can't change it. So it's there. It's just automatically on by default. So it's interesting to me to see some of these features. Like if I'm in the admin portal, why are you forcing me on these preview features to lock down the fact that the capacity admin can enable or disable those things by delegate? So there's a lot of really weird things that are being delegated here. And again, I'm mixing and matching things here a bit, just to be clear. There's things that are delegatable at the capacity level, and there's things that are delegatable by the domain level. There's much less delegatable by the domain, and domains looks like the main thing that can be domain delegated is some of your, I think it's Git integration, whether or not you're using it or not, and whether or not you're doing
solutions.
certification. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I just want to be clear about that there's capacity settings and domain settings are two separate things, but it's this really weird Venn diagram of like how much of it overlaps. Does any of it overlaps? Right. Is there something that's going on there too? So it's nice that we're getting controls. It feels like to me this feature was one really large customer came to Microsoft and said, "Look, we're struggling to manage our tenant. Can you help us? We need collections of workspaces and we need to be able to let them do their own thing so our central IT isn't always burdened by every little request to certify a data set." And I think it feels like what this is some large customer came back to Microsoft. So, oh yeah, Microsoft says, we can easily make you a domain. No problem. We'll make these things called domains. We'll group workspaces together and here you go. Boom, done. Oh, by the way, this is a great feature. Let's roll it out for everyone. Because I feel like it's a bit of a hidden feature that not many companies are using at this point. Any other thoughts around the article?
Well, it also strikes me as another way to get yourself in trouble with self-service models, right? Like it.
How do you mean?
Well, what is your recommendation? Who creates domains? Who organizes the structure of creation of them? It's not an total admin controlled thing. Anybody can create it. So just the same way you walk in and there are a million workspaces for, all the things that aren't really organized. I think what's great about domains is you can start to organize those workspaces. But if all of the teams are doing their own thing and creating their domains and subdomains, et cetera, you've got a kind of a cleanup to do before, like if that group steps in and says, well, actually, this is the way we need, things structured.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of those cases, I would argue it's probably let's take this use case.
Okay.
If you walk in and it's not just a million workspaces, it's a million workspaces and all of these teams have started creating domains and subdomains to contain their workspaces, right?
Sure.
if your job is to architect a better solution, my guess is that a lot of those domains are going to be subdomains, and all of the subdomains that are in there are probably going to go away, because where a lot of, I think, day-to-day individuals working in reports think about their world in a much more microscopic way, like on the micro level instead of macro. And
Yeah.
domains to me are a macro level thing, right?
Yes.
I am building those primarily, and you're talking to a guy who talks about cost all the time. So
Yeah.
it's like, that's where my mind instantly goes.
Yeah.
Ownership, right? Cost, the structure of data within an organization, right?
100%.
Those are all like key. Yeah, I want to use domains. I want to use subdomains. I want to put this, structure around the organization so it makes sense to roll up all these things that I have to deal with on a daily basis, but are also extremely important for the organization to manage, to understand, to control, etc. Right?
Yes.
So those
Yes.
are two competing kind of like worlds in this ecosystem that I think this just presents another touch point where there's potential friction, because yes, this is a great ecosystem, but or I should say self-service and the ability for business to interact and learn and engage in these tool sets is great. But there's always that touch point of like, how does IT and business work together in to produce the best outcomes for the business itself? And there's a mix, and it always has to be a mix. But you can get yourself in trouble with even a lot of things related to that self-service model. Duplication of data, many models doing the same things, 500 reports that are all returning the same 3 columns, et cetera, because of a lack of structure around how people interact with data sets. Because by and large, if you talk to business users or you engage with them before they're even really aware of or use business intelligence tools, they don't think about data that the way we do. They think about it in ways in which I'm gonna get an Excel file. I'm gonna get a data dump of something. I'm gonna,
Yes.
right? Like I just need the stuff, Seth. Like just give me companies and products. That's all I'm looking for, right? But it's a slice for them, and that's like they compile things in such a way to drive value for themselves. They don't think about reusability, of
Yes.
repeatability, of I can leverage and build this thing again if I take the whole slice and then I can dice it, in my report. It's just give me the slice, the very diced piece, and that'll answer my question right now. Right. So I'm just extrapolating like that kind of interaction with the same things of unleashing domains and subdomains into this realm where it's like, oh, I'm going to create Bob's domain and Sally's domain. I'm taking to another level, right? But it's
Yes.
like, well, these are your workspaces, and now like it's something to unwind, and I think reinforces why we're making a recommendation or saying I think that the architecture of domains and subdomains is a higher level function in terms of a committee or data centric people. And I think in the chat, Adrian said data management group 100%, right? Like people who are looking at the domain of data within an organization. They have to have that perspective, not the perspective of individualized groups when you're structuring it.
Interesting. Your comments are bringing up many thoughts that I'm having in my head right now. In my mind, again, I'm thinking like the architecture. I love diagrams. I'm thinking there's now, if I'm thinking about domains, I'm thinking potentially aligning domains to groups of people, and one person may participate in multiple domains. Maybe as I'm looking at the domain features, there's this thing called the default domain, and what you can do is in the default domain, any user assigned to a default domain group, security group. So again, this is all driven by security groups. So let's just imagine we have, again, back to Tommy's example here, right? Tommy's the marketing team. He's got a security group that is the marketing team members. Anytime someone's added into that security group and any user of that security group, if they create a new workspace, it's automatically assigned to the domain. So you can basically bucket teams of people into a domain and say, look, this security group gets this domain, and anyone in that group, as they're creating workspaces, automatically by default get tagged and added to the domain. Because that makes a lot of sense, because you don't want to have how many times I've seen this where there's a group of people in a department, they're building things, and then no one well, who has access to which workspace? Well, I'm in Tommy's group. We should all have access to the same data. That should be a thing. And there's this lack of availability for us to see what Tommy's been building, because there's workspaces being created, but I can't see any of his stuff. But we're in the same department, so it should be fine, right? It's kind of those kind of mentalities. So this is really interesting. The default domain setting, I think, is really impactful. And then going back to your comment, Seth, I really feel like there's this overarching central IT data space that is certified data. And then there's now data domains specifically for teams of people, again, following maybe the manager structure of a company, right? There's the manager of central IT. Central IT may be building lots of lake houses and tables of data for people, and then shortcutting them into a workspace where a domain owner can then pick up and do this. And then if you think about that as well, all of these domains can have individually their own FSKUs, to your point, Seth. Is my department, I can't assume that we're going to use everything 1000% efficient all the time. That is a false assumption. We're not going to have, everyone won't have amazing DAX knowledge. Everything won't be built 100% efficient all the time. So there needs to be flexibility in the system to allow people just to build what they need to get stuff done, even if it isn't efficient. However, we need to also think about when those inefficient or self-service activities are occurring, how is that impacting our central IT of getting data out to the teams, right? We may not want the same capacity for certified data versus departmental data, because they may need two separate SKUs. And that way, when the business unit does a bunch of bad things and builds things poorly, no problem. You only have an F8 SKU. You're running out of capacity. Well, let's go talk about optimizing. Literally give them some rope, do what you need to do. And then when you have problems, come back, and then we can help you optimize, manage, or kill things that are not built correctly, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a behavioral, I think it's a very good thing to do, is let them explore with guardrails, but then rein them back in and have a plan to okay, when things start falling off the rails, come back to Central IT, we'll help you figure it out.
Whenever I hear the term "give them some rope," it usually ends with "so they can hang themselves."
Well, I'm thinking about walking a dog on a leash, right? So I wasn't trying to hurt anyone here on this one, but I was thinking about, sometimes you're walking your dog, and I don't have one, but I've seen people do it. So I used to have dogs, but when you walk your dog, sometimes you keep the leash very tight because it can't handle the situation. We're sniffing every single flower. We're running into different yards. There's other dogs around that you're going to go get distracted. So you keep the leash very short and keep them close to you. But at some point, you have to say, look, I'm going to trust you enough that you know what you're doing. I'm going to let the length of the leash increase a little bit.
But you're not, right? And I think it's such a great point to bring up in the conversation with the default capability, because if you're not giving them so much rope, right, that they can harm themselves.
Correct.
Because ultimately what you're doing is you're governing your system the way you want to.
Yes.
And any actions they take, they're oblivious to the fact that all of this is working underneath the scenes.
Correct.
And because you need it to, right? To your point.
Yeah.
I'm going to spool up another workspace with throwing more capacity at it, and I just maxed out a P1 with what I'm doing. That rolls up under the structure that was
the
built.
Domain.
What is going on?
You're paying for it.
That's commercial under the Mike subdomain. So that's the guy we need to go talk to.
I agree. And
take my earlier.
Yeah. But I think this is to me, this is very important to note here that, that there needs to be really controls around this, that not controls. It's more around the idea of we're trying to balance full self-service and central management all in the same place. And so this is I think a great control mechanism. And I really do subscribe to this. If I buy 3 or 4 F8s and I need to distribute them per department, great. Everyone wants to play in Fabric, no problem. Let's figure out how to take that cost of what you need to do in your domain and roll it up to a certain amount. Okay, the price to play the game is $1,000 a month. Is that valuable enough do you want Power BI that much or do you not? Like, let's really talk about what's going on here. And I think, sometimes I hear until there's better controls or monitoring from Microsoft, and I don't think this is actually existing right now, I'm more apt right now to split the SKUs into smaller SKUs to be able to give people what they need, but yet limit them. And so we limit our costs. So we don't let our costs run wild. If Microsoft had a better method to throttle who was using what or how much of each capacity, I would be more than happy to buy like one F128 or 125, give it to everyone and start dividing it out for the people that need it, right? I can't quarantine sections of cores to different teams using that larger SKU. So because of that, I feel like I have to break my SKUs into multiple SKUs and then give them out by department, which then aligns to breaking them out potentially and giving them by domain, because you can set domains. Everything on this premium capacity gets this domain, which is also very interesting, I think, as well.
Yeah, there's a portion of this I need to look into because I'm not familiar yet, but I'll table it and bring it up.
Okay.
After I look it up.
Okay, sounds good. Tommy, any other thoughts on your land here? You've been kind of quiet on this one. You might be on mute. There you go.
Yes. Honestly, I'm going through the subdomains and going through some of the documentation, and this is still very new for us. I think for a lot of organizations who are getting into Fabric, and just trying to scour the documentation for best practices, just like they have for like data flows.
I don't think they've given you that though. There's almost no best practices here.
They're not in there, man. Those come from you, Tommy.
Yeah, this is purely a how to use the domains. I have to go over to the Power BI adoption roadmap. There might be some implementation planning that talks to domains.
And I think that's the biggest thing where we have the in Power BI, in the Power BI documentation for adoption and governance and administration. That's pretty spelled out in terms of, and they've had security white papers, they've had governance and getting started with Power BI from an enterprise point of view for a long time. They used to be PDFs. And I'm just going through this. I'm like, okay, you can create a domain. Great. They're telling you how to do that. Oh, cool. They're telling you can have an image with your domain, which is fine. But this, I think, for getting started or just beginning to say, hey, we're going to start domains because we have Fabric. I'm worried about the unknown debt of just running in and saying, we're going to create domains kind of like how we do workspaces and, start giving people access through domains without, I think, some proper guidance. I think obviously there's going to be some testing, but this is an awesome feature, both in it's really cool, but also in the impact and the significance of what this can do.
Yeah.
So I think the kind of the guidelines of getting started in here, who's involved, is going to be pretty integral.
Yeah, and I agree. It absolutely will be. In some cases, I'm going to talk about my point that I still need to research because Michael Fortman in the chat is discussing to some of these points. He made an earlier comment where he's saying we were talking about the capacities within the domains, right? And somebody jumping in and like messing up their entire capacity. But he brings up the point not of rope to harm another domain, right? If I'm using capacity across multiple domains and I have a user that comes in and throws down a gnarly model that just consumes everything,
yes,
there could be impacts across domains. And the follow-up comment is, yes, in an organized structure, would it be fantastic if we separated out capacities to each domain? And maybe that is an approach you could take.
Yes.
However, I think it's much more likely that you would have multiple domains sharing capacities. And the thing I have to research or look at is the hope being, and I think domains would do this, is allow me to tag them or understand where the costs are being driven from. And maybe that's a usage thing.
Yes.
But it would also be really keen to understand whether or not any of that tagging would make its way up into Azure cost management, because that's where
a good point too. Yes.
Because where a lot of the monitoring of things happen is in the realms that I can tag a cluster, right? I can tag, something within my ecosystem, so that as I'm looking at costs within Azure related to compute or whatever the case may be, that I can separate or filter or group by those different things. Now, what's interesting is Power BI has always kind of just been it's the SKU, it's the capacity, right? So maybe some of this is going to be driven in the administrative reporting, where hopefully we'll have grouping around domains and subdomains of who's the largest user of capacity or the most memory, and maybe that's more of a logical place to stick the that type of reporting as opposed to the higher level. But my thought was around Azure cost management, because I spend a lot of time up in there.
I like where you're going with that one, Seth, and I think that's another one. I'm not sure if I see. So two things. One, I found the article that is in implementation plan. There's a whole section on talking about building domains and what does that look like. And I think the idea here is what Microsoft's alluding to is the domains are supposed to align to potentially what your organization domains are looking like, right? You have domains for central IT, you have domains for different departments. Those domains almost equivocate to what I would say is departments. From Michael's comment in the chat here talking about, well, yeah, 2 F32s do make sense because that is the same amount of compute just divided across 2 different SKUs. The costs are actually identical too, right? If you buy one F64 or 2 F32s, there's no additional discount for buying more capacity at that higher amount. It's literally a linear, the more cores you buy, the more pieces you get. So that is very nice as well. He does make a really interesting point that I do want to point out is there is a quote unquote feature unlock when you hit an F64. There are a couple features that are only F64 enabled and larger, particularly around like one of the features is like a free user of Power BI licensing, like the free license of a Power BI user can't show up to PowerBI.com unless you're on an F64 to use that experience. So there is some limitations there as well. So by using smaller F SKUs, yes, you can do them, but there are some feature limitations. So you kind of have to be mindful of that from a governing standpoint. But in general, I like this idea of being able to quarantine different departments and let them only use certain things. Another point around this, Seth, too, is if I'm using Fabric, I don't have the ability of turning off separate workloads inside a Fabric capacity. And this is something that really bugs me right now. I can't turn off Data Activator in a Fabric capacity. There's no option to say in this capacity, I only want it to use notebooks and lakehouses, or notebooks, lakehouses, and SQL Analytics endpoints. Like, to me, there's potential. Like, people will have access to Fabric, and I get it. Microsoft wants you to, here's all the tools, build whatever you want.
Don't limit
me,
Mike. Don't limit the people.
Yeah, but I if we're
You're
talking
not the man anymore.
I know, I get it, but and I guess my approach here is I'm not saying let's limit everything forever. I think let's just start with a limited set of features. I think honestly, people are overwhelmed. A lot of people I talk to want to use Fabric. It's
of course they are.
But then they don't know what to start with. Like,
I know.
And that's where I feel like having something where we're saying, look, I'm going to start you in Fabric and we're going to start you off with, let's get you beginning with lakehouses and notebooks. Let's start there. And Dataflow Gen 2. These are the things we're going to start with. Let's begin with that. And then as they become comfortable with it, I think more and more people are going to continue to adopt Fabric at a much larger scale and do more things in it.
Yeah.
Because the use cases will come, but I don't want it to day one just have like open everything. And now with all these extra features that are out there, I mean, there's a ton of features inside your tenant. There's new preview features showing up. I don't want those on yet. I want to slowly roll them out.
Yeah, I think the important point here is that before anyone gets the idea that they can just walk around and and go, you get an F SKU and you get an F SKU. Like you're at the F64 level for all the capabilities. So it's kind of like you get 60,000 a year. You get 60,000 a year. It's like it ain't cheap when you go that route. So hey, bigger organizations, that's fine. But it's also some of the
value.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if every department is getting enough value, that 60 grand a year, and like you could be coming from an older system that has way more costs. I've seen some people move from systems that are extremely more expensive
I do think this is a great way though for even for organizations that have had the Wild West sprawl, and we know of them, right? Like where the proliferation of PSQs or F64s are all over the place. That this is definitely a way the organization could get their heads around like what all like, because you'd have to go through this consolidation of like, we have all of these workspaces, where do they belong? And a fantastic way of doing that would potentially be through, what do they call it now? Azure Entra ID, right? The old Azure AD, where you look at the users who are the owners of those workspaces. And now you can do two things. One is you can define what area potentially is the domain of that workspace, but then on the opposite side of that, make that user part of a default domain going forward, right? Where all their stuff gets continually created. So as you're cleaning up that ecosystem, you're understanding where the cost structures are, you're then starting to manage it at a much better level than organizations have had before.
I totally would agree with that one. Again, I think this is just, again, balancing what we need to manage versus what we don't need to manage. All right. With that, I think we've had enough conversation around domains. Good thoughts. Really like the chat here, thinking about these domains as well. So really appreciate chat jumping in there. All the comments have been very useful. Really appreciate you jumping in and chatting with us. We really love that. Tommy, where else can we find the podcast?
You can find the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you hear podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating. It helps it a ton. Do you have a question, idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of PowerBI.tips social media channels.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation on domains. I think this is still something that is underused inside the Power BI or Fabric ecosystem. Check it out. It might be useful for your organization, especially if you're a larger organization that has many users in there. So I think it might be a good way of helping you manage costs and or delegating permissions to domain experts. With that, thank you all very much. We really appreciate your time. Good conversation. We'll see you next time.